Cool. So yeah, let me know when I should start.
Okay, just give me a few sec.
Okay.
Awesome, you can go ahead.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me over, and also thank you so much for participating and joining. In the presentation, by the way, it's very late here, so I might be a bit slower, and it might also make sense to rewatch the recording at twice the speed later, but I'll try to keep my thoughts together as much as possible. I just usually sleep at that time. Anyway, so thanks so much for coming around. In the next about 20 minutes, I'll try to give you an idea about where to start and how to actually approach designing your organization. So it's more kind of geared towards people, or if you're interested in actually participating in a DAO or organization, or if you're interested in building one. If you are already creating one, or if you have your own business, then I hope this is also going to be valuable. But some of the basics will be more the focus here. Yet I think there's still going to be a lot of stuff. First of all, before I continue, I just want to kind of point out that most of the work and pretty much everything that I'm going to present here is based on the work that I've done and research that I've done designing Deepwork, which is a design studio. And also I highly kind of appreciate but thank in particular everybody who's contributed to Deepwork so far, because there's no obligation for anyone to work there. Everybody's a freelancer, or everybody kind of can decide what they want to work on, and yet still everybody has over the last 3 years designed over like 40 different projects in the Web3 ecosystem. Some of them you will be familiar with. And also, if you're looking for design or user research freelancers, please don't hesitate reaching out to these people. They're really good, especially if they have worked on projects already. So before I start with the kind of principles or really guidelines, I think it's worth mentioning that there's a clear trend in society for people moving more towards freelance occupation, because they feel like there's some kind of inconsistency in organizational work, or like working in a job, or they don't have the sense that they work with a particular meaning that they desire. And I think that that's pretty correct, and there's probably most likely historical foundation to that, at least based on my research, because before the Middle Ages, people considered work as being something part of life, like part of a meaningful life, like eating and sleeping. And in the Middle Ages, the Christian chauvinists decided that doing work is essentially the same as being a good person, or they basically attached that to the idea of being a good person, because you do the work, profits go to the church, church decides to distribute that across the poor, and then that great, because God is happy. And that same kind of construct translated over into the industrialization, where the profits were distributed by factory owners how they wanted. And because that, and that's basically been persisting, kind of the persisting model ever since, which neo-economists have picked up on in order to describe actually how the economy works, because they were seeing that people do the work, even if they don't like it, they still kind of go to work, go through the stuff, even if it's boring, and then they afford leisure for the money that they earn. And so that's apparently the model that is kind of describes the the flourishing of the economy, essentially. But they basically make the assumption that work is being seen as this utility. But the reason why I'm kind of explaining this is because I don't think that's a good start to think about designing organizations or designing a work environment, because if we want to approach designing something, we should consider that, well, we want to design something that an individual wants to be actually part of, where people see and understand that they're being fairly compensated. And I think that's the very first thing to really consider, or like kind of a goal to achieve when approaching the design, so that people actually have a sense of meaning and purpose, and also consider that they're being fairly compensated. And a path to that is relatively unpredictable and kind of fuzzy. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that here. There's other resources that I'm working on, or like educational resources that I'm working on that describe that in more detail. But essentially, that's a path that every freelancer or every organization has to go through. Like this kind of discovery usually starts with people having a fantastic idea, and then we think that's already really developed, but that's usually not the case, and it just costs a lot of work to actually get to the point where, or experimentation and prototyping, to get to the point where that's recognizable and the value is really clear in what the work consists of. And to make that process easier, and this is just kind of scratching the surface, if you want to get to that point, especially if you're like trying to be a freelancer or have an organization, you want to start by defining exactly the problem that you're solving, and because that's essentially kind of what other people will pick up on, and that consists of getting confidence in your abilities, specializing on that particular solution, and then also projectizing it to make it, to communicate that. And then you test that with your environment, and you kind of ask your environment if they're willing to pay for that. And so based on this interaction between you and your environment, you get clearer and clearer about the transaction and cost. And it's also important to start really small in that particular space. So like Amazon started by selling books, for example. I mean, that's obvious, but they started with a very, very small thing. And they didn't really, obviously they considered growth and they considered the kind of ecosystem approach, but any organization has to start small. Slack is also a very good example because they started working on only their own problem. They specified it. They were like, how do we communicate within a team? How do we build games within a team? And then they started kind of evolving that into its own software. So you focus on your own value, you try to define your environment as much as possible, and then that defines the cost and the value transaction. Also, don't fall for hoping that someone else will, provide a skill for you that you need, or like, some developer will build your thing. That's not how it works. Then if you're obviously an organization, then you find a team of people who have a certain domain expertise, and that covers a larger environment, and basically leads to kind of this positive sum collaboration. Like this is just an example. I think Nexus Mutual would fall into, although I don't know their team, but it's a different, it's a combination of different skills where everybody can focus on their own depth of expertise, and that makes them that creates this positive sum project essentially. The other thing that's kind of important, based on like after you have that foundation, is the kind of transparency. And transparency is generally a big term in Web3, but I'm going to briefly explain to you why it's specifically important here. Because if you don't want to like hire people or recruit them, like we know how the job market, doesn't actually work. Like there's always missed expectations, and it just doesn't feel right. But you want to basically have people come and join and contribute and do stuff. They need to see what's going on. So they need to see exactly what is going on, and they need to see who is doing what. And that is like still a very kind of underdeveloped, I think, part of the Web3 ecosystem, even though it already exists in larger organizations like in Bridgewater from Ray Dalio, or in McKinsey. They're very focused on kind of being transparent. Obviously they keep that closed inside, which is another thing that we can approach differently in Web3 for other reasons I'll get into in a moment. But they are very transparent about what exactly is going on, so that when people come in, they actually start developing individual relationships with each other and have actual transparent feedback that is based on honesty and truth that everybody can look up, and that makes sure that everybody's on the same page about everything all the time. Obviously, you have to evolve these things along the way, but I'll also get into that a bit later. McKinsey is a really good example because they do a really, really good job at this. And I also believe that transparency is a pretty good, is very beneficial for financial data, as long as it's clear that it doesn't bring any person into danger. In game theory, there's a political scientist called Robert Axelrod, and he describes that actors in a system who share the strategies with each other end up being in an equilibrium if they're being transparent about their approaches. So I think that applies quite well, or like our opportunity in Web3 is actually applying that principle on a very large scale. Although that will take a while, I think it's good to keep that in mind. And it also makes onboarding in our organization a lot easier. So especially if you're, I don't know how much you're, if you're like, community managers, or if you own an organization, or if you're starting to build one, this is going to be a very big problem, that people want to figure out how to join your organization, how to contribute, but they don't know how and where. But this is like one of the key things that I think are valuable in terms of transparency, is kind of showing people what's going on, showing people the projects, because then you don't rely on like dummy projects from Rabbit Hole or Gitcoin. They're good for onboarding in Web3 in general, but not to your particular organization. Because if you're transparent, people can just join, shadow, and start to contribute to the actual projects. And a lot of organizations, again, do the same way, except they don't make it really transparent, like across different organizations. They don't make it open. And you actually don't even need Web3 tools for that. So none of what I'm describing requires blockchain or anything. Deepwork uses Gitbook or Google Sheets for financial data. It's very straightforward. Obviously, at a larger scale, it will have to utilize blockchain-based applications or technology, but that is solving very, very different problems than you will find if you're just creating an organization. In essence, like that transparency kind of helps transition from somehow hiring the perfect candidate or finding the best job to actually establishing truthful relationships. And just keep in mind that if you're designing any kind of onboarding documentation, then make sure that it's understandable for other people and not just a bucket of notes. And of course, with Web3, we'll soon also have tools that will make this kind of reputation and all of this internal reputation easier, so we can apply Web3 tools, because currently reputation is locked up in organizations for reasons of competition and privacy, but that, I think, there is a potential to kind of change. Like, as long as you know what projects and what roles you have in an organization, that's like a big part of who you are as an individual. And if we can, and this is also something that zero knowledge proofs are very useful for, but also I'm not going to go into that in this topic or in this presentation. If you utilize those, you allow people essentially to take control over their own identity, share only what they want, but you need that data, and that data has to be produced by organizations essentially, or people working in these organizations. So in essence, I think what we are aiming for, and this is kind of slowly drifting towards actually design principles, is we want to find kind of the combination or the middle between permissionlessness of online communities, where people can just join and do and contribute, with the social dynamics and the value-driven organizations. The combination of both is obviously complicated or complex. There's actually really, really excellent research from my friends at Block Science, especially on the topic of the viable system model from Stafford Bear. This describes basically how an organizational structure can mimic the principles or mimic the behaviors of a biological organism. It's very interesting. You should definitely check it out. also again something that I'm not going to go into here, but that's a foundation of how these things can be combined. Because so I have this kind of analogy that I can see a lot of organizations or DAO, self-proclaimed DAOs describing themselves DAOs as like my analogy is basically like using a token and calling it a DAO is like taking protein powder and magnesium and calling it a healthy lifestyle. There's a lot of things that you have to consider, a lot of things you have to build on, and these are it just takes time. And so the aspect of time is more something that's that relies on this kind of design process. So and the design process is actually quite, so this is probably also one of the core principles of design that is important to point out, or maybe like a little bit counterintuitive, because you start off by just observing what's going on. So if you design an organization, you just look at what people are doing, and then you help them do more of that. So you select the behaviors that you think are right and desirable, and automate your support by building infrastructure and using tools. So kind of like building roads for people. This is just a constraints for the things that you don't want them to do, and make the other things a lot easier. And this actually very applicable to just any kind of design. So any kind of digital product works like that. Also, I really recommend going to Justina's presentation tomorrow. She's also talking about product design and user research. Very relevant and going a little bit deeper into this topic. Yeah, you kind of combining what you think is good for the collective with what you're observing, what people want to engage in, and then that becomes this delightful work or delightful activities that people actually don't consider work. They just do it because they love it. Even more important is this principle when you start involving financial systems. So, or like a token, for example, it's very like dangerous thing to play with if you promise people a token without that foundation. If you just mint a token and put it on Uniswap, it has a certain value, and then you have your like community and legal institutions figure out your name and your country, and then you basically just go to jail because you're making promises on something that's not existing. If at least if you follow that, if you just mint a token and assign it some value, so you have to first observe the value or the value exchange, and then you automate that with a token. And for the most part, you don't need a token. For the most part, these things can be resolved with a spreadsheet. So I just generally kind of want to suggest you to not start off with the token, but if you want to start an organization or you even have a token, like be careful with it. Start with a spreadsheet, because chances are that you just don't need one. Token is only like when you scale up very, very broadly. Obviously, if you're interested in economics, you can say that the entire world works like monetary assets are not designed like that. But yes, that's probably true, but that's also not the topic for this conversation. So one of the last things I want to touch on is basically and probably also one of the most important ones is the ability to make an organization resilient, and especially in uncertain market conditions, and adaptive and self-improving, similar to a biological organism. At least in my experience, and this is something that I don't have a lot of actual genuine research on in existing organizations. There's been attempts to that, and specifically in Holacracy. Sorry?
I know this is about
Didn't even say something.
swing the other way.
All right. Okay. There's been attempts to do something similar, especially in holacracy or sociocracy. But in my experience, the best way to approach it is they're very, very precise about all kinds of work. Basically, converting all the work that you do into purely project-based work with the goal of building recurring projects. So, as you might realize, the work and how it's being tracked is mostly based on hours, but time is not really an adequate measure of of work, whether it's time tracking or
It's you
counting
that know
hours
the day, God
or
bless
having a
them,
day
sha, for
rate or
taking it
something.
for
It's
granted.
not representative of the actual output or the outcome, where a lot more consistent results or like a lot more clarity you will receive if you actually projectize and standardize your deliverables and outcomes, and learn to be able to communicate those and make sure that you can repeat them on a recurring basis.
I say you,
So that consists of essentially defining a process. So what is a certain project stuff, and that project can also be a month. Like you can say, okay, in a given month I'm doing these tasks. Then you define the duration. So again, whatever that is. I mean, in my experience, 2 weeks is usually a pretty good average because you can keep track of everything.
I swear.
And then the outcome. So what is actually the result of that? And that keeps people motivated. Also, there's parallels in neuroscience. That's how people actually get motivated about doing stuff if they know these 3 conditions. But it also gives you a chance to find a retrospective or like conduct a retrospective and then learn from that particular scope of work and improve that next time, improve it another time. If you want to go a step further and if you're like creating your own business and stuff, then you just like count that you can count the hours, compare that to the current market rate, because we still live in that economy, and then you say you add your profit margin, you put that in the proposal, and then you put that in front of the client or stakeholder. That's essentially also like a grant proposal or something that's exactly that.
I don't know. I'm asking whether you're going to do
and then you define that gives you the cost of the entire project, and you can say this project costs exactly this much. And so I think this kind of way of thinking about work as recurring projects allows a lot of opportunities, like actual meritocratic compensation. It has the frequent feedback loops, so you improve the process, but you improve the individuals as well. You can use that as a trackable reputation, and also there's no need to employ people full-time or be a full-time employed because you just participate in other projects, or from the other perspective, you're just hiring people for a particular project and decentralizing the risk, because then if no work happens, then there's no projects, and then nobody has to do anything instead of just sitting around and like hoping that something will come up. And also, people understand these dynamics, and that because they don't have written contracts they can rely on, at least in my experience, they focus much more on the social relationships and the interpersonal relationships between individuals, which I think is actually a lot more valuable than kind of looking at some paperwork and trying to make sense of your salary and hope that that's going to work for a very long time, or finding stability in that. So anyway, there's actually very excellent tools to do that. So Asana or Notion are very easy to use and make all the work public. I recommend also connecting that to Typeform or Zapier. So if you want to create a project, you use Typeform, connect it with Zapier to Notion, and it's like right there. Typeform's the interface, Zapier connection, Notion, that's where it shows up. Another tool that I can also recommend checking out is Solo. It's just a little bit of a different perspective. It shows you the roles and the people who are actually doing the work, like what their
you were even the one that reminded me that there was a holiday that was coming.
What you call their roles, what you call their workflows,
all of a sudden,
which teams they belong to.
True.
It's just a very nice way to
like
put
I said,
it.
I don't know
And then the last thing that I just want to kind of briefly mention is the importance of soft governance. Again, steering away from highly like automated and algorithmic governance or token-based governance. I think these things have gained a lot of popularity in the last year, but they're actually not good tools if you want to make decisions together. If you want to get people to align, and especially if you try to like imagine a project, well, what is a project? For you, the project is something different than to your friend or to someone else, or even to your stakeholders. So you need to involve people together and actually discuss these things and really agree on those in human, speakable, readable language. Design thinking tools are really, really efficient and powerful in order to align a team on these things. There's also a lot of stuff that I'm posting on my Instagram channel that's kind of related to how to get people to align with each other. So before you throw yourself into Snapshot, think about like the actual interpersonal relationships and this kind of idea of soft governance. I don't know if that's a term, but I just came up with it. There's also an interesting, very final piece. This interesting research from Google. I think from 2012. They had a project called Project Aristotle, which basically had the goal of finding and discovering how to build the best team or the perfect team, whatever that would mean. And that essentially consisted of interviewing a lot of teams, figuring out what makes them really good. And they couldn't really figure it out because they were thinking there must be some skills or some backgrounds, but that didn't seem to be the case. They couldn't find any patterns. And then they switched over to looking at leadership styles. That also didn't really work out. And then eventually they ended up realizing after several years that there's kind of two common threads, two groups that seem to be very interesting and efficient. And one of them was that everybody was very empathetic. And
should we say you want to speak? Why is this one calling?
Everybody was very empathetic and kind of understood everybody else's emotion and facial expressions, and everybody spoke about approximately the same amount of time on a given project. So that's also just something to consider. People who work there considered their work not really as work, but more like something like an activity with their friends. A lot of times these projects carried over outside of the work environment, and generally people felt very open and kind of vulnerable to the co-workers. So obviously I'm always scratching the surface on these things. I talked about innovation, the radical transparency, designing for emergent, project-based work, soft governance, and if you have any questions, please feel free to also reach out to me on Twitter or on Instagram. I post a lot of like additional content on Instagram and Twitter at the moment, like more smaller bits and pieces. Also, if you're interested in tools that I'm using, it's also all there, or in my bio you'll find either tools and resources, and obviously you can check out Deepwork. As obviously I've showed here, everything is transparent, so you can see which tools we're using and how we're using them. Please don't hesitate asking me any questions. I'm always interested in what is currently kind of on your mind and what can help more.
As in the recording.
And thanks so much for your interest in design, and enjoy the rest of the
want to go and sleep,
Codeless Conduct Conference.
Wait, Joe, I want to talk to you 2 seconds.
I'm going to stop sharing this now.
Andrej, great presentation. Can I ask a question? Just
yes, of course.
How you do what you do, like so if we wanted to be able to leverage, I guess, your knowledge and tools, like what's the best way to frame that offering? And mechanically, how does it work? If someone comes to you or to Deepwork, and then what does that relationship look like there?
Wait, choose one.
So you mean tools sorry?
Yeah,
what was that exactly?
Leverage what you've built.
Please.
Oh, okay. So
good.
Right. So okay. That's a good point. So
hello?
There's multiple ways. So first of all, it kind of depends on what you're interested in. So if you want to, for example, just work in Deepwork, there's a quick start guide. Like that's just kind of getting you into the project.
I'm around.
If you want
Tell them you're coming to
basically leverage the infrastructure in order to, for example, like create your own little project that might evolve into an organization.
Sorry.
We're working on I don't know if this is sharing, is it? Yeah. So we have a very kind of basic process so far for incubating projects that start with like an idea, and then we kind of guide them towards something. This is something that I actually really want to evolve further. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and I'll help you with that. So the infrastructure is all set up. It's just like basically you have a project, you find people. If you have an idea, you can choose someone to kind of guide you through it. Either there will be funding from Deepwork if it's something relevant, or you just do it on your own and use that infrastructure.
That's what I was talking to. We'll soon round up.
And keep evolving that. So there's like workshops and kind of a project setup, define the cost if that's something that costs money, and then you kind of leverage the whole community. There's also an application that we built, but this is very specific to if you already have an idea or if you already have an organization, and this is like an MVP, so it's like far from finished, and we're actually starting a project tomorrow on building something that's more accessible. But essentially, this tool lets you create an organization if you already have one. The main point of that is if you already have roles established, that you can scale them, that you can multiply them. So you find an organization, there's a project running, you can click on it, and then I have like a couple of applications already, and then I can review like who wants to work with me, and people can choose what they want to work on the project, complete it, and then that pops up in their profile either as a finished project, but also as a skill if that was a particular role on the project. So if I'm taking the creative director, then I have that role here, and that consists of all the things that I need to do. So that's kind of a kit. Everything else so far in Deepwork is like a combination of existing no-code tools, and so we're slowly still introducing those. Does that kind of cover, or like does that touch on what you were interested in? Otherwise, I'm also happy to like talk outside of this.
Yeah, no, it does. I followed you on Twitter. I'd love to talk to you more about how we can use you. Like, people come to us like very early, right? And they end up getting the concept a lot with us, and so I've had to like work on this with people quite a bit, and that it kind of strays a little bit out of our lane, but as part of the value, I feel like I would love to know how working with you can make what we do easier and how that can go. So I added you on Twitter.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Let's just catch up sometime when you have time. Send me a message on Twitter so I know your tag name. But yeah, happy to dive into it deeper. Cool. Does anybody else have any questions? Am I still on time, or is it the next speaker already?
No, you're definitely on time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, does anybody else have any questions? Cool. Well, if you, again, yeah, feel free to add me on Twitter or Instagram if you want to know more, or if you want to just keep in the loop, or send me a message. But yeah, otherwise, thank you so much. That was very pleasant. I hope you don't mind if I go to sleep now, unless I can answer any other questions.
Thank you so much, Andrej.
Cool. All right. Well, have a great night, and I see you soon.
Have a good one. Thank you. Awesome. So Harsh has just joined the Town Hall channel. So